The letter fell from her fingers before she finished reading it. Aurelia Langford stood in the middle of the crowded general store in Dusty Creek, Texas, 1882, and she felt the world collapse inward around her chest like a mine shaft giving way. Her lips pressed together in a line so tight they went white at the edges. Her eyes did not fill with tears. She had learned, in the 31 years of her life, that tears were something you showed to people who cared, and she was surrounded by strangers who would use her grief as gossip before sunset. The letter was from her brother-in-law's solicitor in San Antonio. 3 sentences. That was all it had taken to end everything she had built since her husband Robert's death, 2 years prior. The Langford Ranch, the 160 acres she had worked with bleeding hands and a shattered heart, the cattle she had nursed through drought and tick fever, the small house with the blue curtains she had sewn herself. All of it was being contested in probate court. Robert had died without updating his will, and his brother Edmund was claiming every inch of it as the male heir. She folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. She placed it in the pocket of her calico dress. She lifted her chin. She did not cry. She moved through the store selecting the flour and the salt she had come for, placing coins on the counter, nodding to the shopkeeper as though her entire existence had not just been legally threatened in a single paragraph. She was good at this. She had been doing it since she was a child, learning to wrap her devastation in practical movements, to keep her hands busy so her face could remain composed. She did not know that she had been watched from the moment she walked in. Lyle Irons had come into Dusty Creek for fencing wire, and had found himself standing near the back of Callaway's general store with his arms full of iron staples, watching the woman in the blue calico dress read a letter that changed the entire quality of the air around her. He was not a man who paid close attention to other people's business. He had 4,200 head of cattle, a ranch that stretched across 3 ridgelines, and more than enough trouble of his own to fill every waking hour. He was 34 years old and had been described by his foreman, Pete Marsh, as a man who was about as readable as a stone wall and twice as hard to move. He had built the Irons Ranch from nothing after his father gambled away the family property in Abilene, and he had done it with the kind of focused, relentless labor that left little room for anything soft. But something about the way that woman stood absolutely still while the storm moved through her stopped him cold. He had seen men take cannon fire with less composure, and somehow that composure was the saddest thing he had ever witnessed. She came out of the store just as he was loading his wagon, and he almost said something. Instead, he watched her walk to her own buckboard with straight shoulders and steady hands, climb up without assistance, and drive away with her eyes fixed on the road ahead like she was navigating by sheer force of will. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that within 6 days, their paths would collide in a way that would crack them both open. It had been 2 years since Robert Langford died of a burst appendix on a Tuesday morning in October, and Aurelia had not grieved him the way people expected. Not because she hadn't loved him, but because the grief had been more complicated than the word itself could hold. Robert had been a decent man, reliable, not unkind. But he had been a man who looked through her more often than he looked at her, who appreciated her competence the way a farmer appreciates a good fence, useful, necessary, not particularly worthy of admiration. She had learned to be invisible in her own home long before she learned to be invisible in town. After he died, she had kept the ranch running with the help of 2 ranch hands, Denny and Cal, who were loyal enough and capable enough when she gave them clear direction. She had made every decision. She had driven cattle to market herself when Denny broke his wrist in August. She had renegotiated the lease on the eastern pasture when the neighboring landowner tried to increase the terms by 40%. She had done all of this while wearing the face of a woman who was simply managing. The letter from the solicitor, whose name was Mr. Harlan Croft, had informed her that Edmund Langford of San Antonio had filed a legal claim against the estate and had retained a lawyer who specialized, specifically, in widows' land disputes. Edmund had never visited the ranch in the 5 years she and Robert had lived there. He had never offered assistance when the drought killed 40 head in the summer of 1880. He had sent a single wreath when Robert died and had not attended the funeral. Now he wanted the land. Aurelia drove the buckboard home and unhitched the horse with mechanical efficiency and went inside the house and stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. This was when Lyle Iron's fence came down, not metaphorically. Literally. The section of his eastern fence line that bordered the creek had been undercut by 3 days of heavy rain, and 60 head of his cattle crossed into the adjacent property at dawn, 2 days after Aurelia received her letter. The adjacent property was hers. She found them in her south pasture at 6 in the morning, large red cattle with the Irons brand on their left hip, chewing contentedly through grass she needed for her own 20 head. She was already exhausted and already afraid, and she did not have the patience for other people's cattle in her field. She rode out to the Irons ranch herself. The Irons ranch house was larger than she expected. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and side, and a barn that was twice the size of her own. 3 cowboys were working horses in the paddock. A dog came running up to her horse and then stopped, tail wagging uncertainly. She dismounted at the front gate and walked up the porch steps and knocked. The man who answered the door was tall. Not in the exaggerated way of dime novel cowboys, but genuinely, practically tall, with wide shoulders that suggested years of physical labor rather than display. His hair was dark brown, a little overgrown, and his eyes were the color of deep water, the kind of blue that looks almost gray in certain light. He was wearing work clothes, not Sunday ones, and he looked like he had been up since before dawn, which he had. "You're on the Irons ranch," he said. "I know where I am," she said. "I'm Aurelia Langford from the Langford quarter section east of your creek fence. You have 60 head of your cattle in my south pasture." Something moved across his face, not quite apology, not quite surprise. Recognition of a problem he had already been aware of and had not yet addressed. "I know," he said. "The fence came down in the rain. I was planning to ride over this morning." "I've come to save you the trip," she said. "I need them moved before noon. My cattle need that grass." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. He did not look at her the way men usually looked at her, which was either with dismissal or with the particular type of assessment that made her feel like livestock. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are genuinely trying to understand. "I'll have my men drive them back within the hour," he said. "I'm Lyle Irons. I apologize for the inconvenience, Mrs. Langford." She had not told him her married name. He had made a guess, or he had known of her already, or he had seen the grief still living in the corners of her face. She nodded. "I'd appreciate that." She turned to go. "Mrs. Langford," he said. She stopped. "Is there anything else you need while I'm out that way?" "I should walk the fence line and my section borders yours for nearly a quarter mile. If your fence needs looking at too, I'm happy to have my men address it." It was a practical offer. Sensible. She should have said no, because she did not need favors from a man she did not know, and because accepting help had always felt like exposing a weakness she could not afford to show. She said, "My north corner post has been leaning since the spring. If it's no trouble." He nodded once. No trouble. The cattle were moved in 40 minutes. She watched from her porch with a cup of coffee she didn't drink as 5 riders pushed the Irons cattle back through the repaired break in the fence. The tall man was among them. He came himself rather than sending someone else, which she noted because it was not what she expected. He stopped his horse at the edge of her property line and touched the brim of his hat in her direction before riding back. She did not return the gesture, but she did not look away either. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the letter from Harlan Croft open in front of her, and her brother-in-law's betrayal laid out in legal language that was somehow colder than a direct accusation. She read it 3 times. She worked out in her head what it would cost to hire a lawyer. She thought about the 2 years she had put into the land, the choices she had made, the life she had built from grief and obligation. She thought about the north corner post, which was now standing straight in its repaired position. She had gone out to check it before dark. He had done a good job. She folded the letter away, went to bed, and did not sleep. Aurelia rode into Dusty Creek 2 days later to send a telegram to a lawyer she had been referred to by the county sheriff, a man named Crawford who occasionally represented small landowners. She was waiting in line at the telegraph office when a conversation at the counter pulled her attention sideways without meaning to. Lyle Irons was at the counter ahead of her, and he was speaking with the telegraph operator about a shipment of cattle that was being disputed by a buyer in Abilene. She heard the name Edmund Langford and went very still. She must have made some small sound, because Lyle turned and saw her standing there, and his expression shifted into something careful and quiet. "Mrs. Langford," he said, stepping aside from the counter. "Go ahead." "I heard a name," she said. She kept her voice even. "Edmund Langford, the buyer in your dispute." Lyle's eyes sharpened. "You know him." "He is my husband's brother," she said. "He is currently attempting to take my ranch through the probate courts." There was a silence between them that felt like a held breath. "He's been refusing to pay the contracted price on 200 head. I sold him through a broker last spring," Lyle said. "He keeps finding reasons to delay. My lawyer says he's been doing it to several small ranchers in this county." Aurelia felt something cold and focused move through her chest. "He's not just after my land," she said, thinking out loud without meaning to. "He's buying up everything. He's using probate law and debt and delayed payment to—" She stopped herself. She had said too much to a man she had met once. She looked away. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's my business, not yours." "It might be both of ours," Lyle said. She looked back at him. He was not crowding her. He was standing at a comfortable distance, watching her with that same attentive expression she had noticed before, as though he was reading something in her that most people never tried to read. She did not trust it. She had learned that men who paid attention were not always safe. She sent her telegram and left. The thing about Aurelia Langford's sadness was that she had become expert at disguise. She wore practicality the way other women wore shawls, over everything, covering everything, making her look warm and functional and self-contained from the outside while the wind went straight through underneath. She kept her grief about her husband's neglect locked behind her competence. She kept her fear about the ranch locked behind her efficiency. She kept the deep, particular loneliness of having no one to speak plainly to locked behind politeness and routine. She was aware that she was lonely. She was not willing to admit it to anyone, including herself, in the daylight. She had a neighbor, Martha Teller, who came sometimes for coffee and who talked endlessly about her grandchildren. And Aurelia listened and smiled and said appropriate things and went home feeling more alone than before. She had Denny and Cal, who were respectful and hardworking, and who addressed her as Mrs. Langford with the deference owed to an employer. which meant that no real conversation had ever passed between them. She had Robert's grave on the hill behind the house, and she visited it on Sundays not because she missed him exactly, but because it was the only place she had permission to feel something without explaining herself. Lyle Irons had no business noticing any of this, but he noticed. He came to her place the following Thursday, ostensibly to discuss the shared fence line and a potential issue with water rights on the creek that might affect both properties. He brought a written summary of the relevant county survey documents. He sat on her porch when she offered it and drank the coffee she made without being asked whether he wanted it. He was not trying to charm her. That was the thing that made her pay attention. He was simply talking to her, as though she was a person of full intelligence and relevance, and asking her questions about the eastern pasture drainage and the creek's seasonal variation that made clear he considered her knowledge to be worth having. He did not explain things she already knew. He did not tell her what she should do with her own land. She found herself talking more freely than she had intended. "The creek has dropped 3 inches in the last 6 weeks," she said. "Lower than it was the same time last year. If it keeps going, I'll have to haul water to the North Trough by August." "I've been watching the same thing," he said. "I put a marker in last fall. It's down 4 inches at my side of the line." "The drought's coming back," she said. "Might be," he said. He looked at the line of cottonwoods along the creek bank with the considering look of a man planning several moves ahead. "If we coordinate on water management before it gets critical, both operations would be better off than each trying to solve it separately." It was practical. She knew it was practical. She also knew that saying yes to cooperation meant continued contact, and continued contact meant continued exposure to the unsettling experience of being seen. "All right," she said. "We can talk about it." He stayed another hour. They talked about the drought and about the cattle market, and about a new grass seed variety being sold at the agricultural supply in the next town over. He did not ask her anything personal. He did not ask about her husband or the legal trouble or whether she was all right. He did not ask, but he was watching. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the porch railing and turned to say goodbye, and she had let her face relax in the way you do when you think you're alone. And the grief and exhaustion were there, briefly, clearly visible in the set of her mouth and the weight in her eyes. He looked at her for one quiet moment. "I'll be back next week to check the creek marker," he said. She put the composed face back on so quickly she was sure he hadn't noticed. "I'll have the numbers from my side ready," she said. He put his hat on. He walked to his horse. He mounted and rode without looking back. She stood on the porch after he was gone and realized that her chest felt fractionally lighter than it had in weeks, and that this frightened her more than the legal letter had. The legal situation with Edmund escalated faster than she expected. Harlan Croft's follow-up letter arrived the next week with a court date set for 8 weeks hence in San Antonio. Edmund's lawyer was a man named Breckenridge Foster, who was known in probate circles for his skill at exploiting loopholes in frontier estate law that rarely protected widows without explicit documentation of inheritance rights. Robert had died without a will that named her as primary beneficiary, and in the absence of living children, the law in Texas in 1882 was genuinely ambiguous on the question of a widow's claim against a male heir. She sat with her own lawyer's letter. Crawford had agreed to represent her, and tried to calculate what it would cost and what the likelihood of success was, and the numbers were not encouraging. She needed money to fight it. Fighting it would drain the resources she needed to keep the ranch running through whatever drought was coming. Losing the fight meant losing everything. Not fighting meant losing everything faster. She went to check the creek marker on Tuesday morning and found that Lyle had already been there, had marked the new level in careful numbers on the stake, and had left a note in a tin container at the base of it. The note said, "Level down another half-inch since Saturday." I spoke with a hydrologist who surveys for the railroad. He says the aquifer feeding this creek has been drawing down for 3 years. Wanted you to have that information. L. Irons. She read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She did not know what to do with a man who left her information in a tin can by a creek marker instead of waiting to tell her himself. As though he understood that she needed data more than she needed conversation. As though he had taken stock of what she actually required, rather than what was convenient for him. He came on Thursday as he said he would. They walked the creek line together for the first time, side by side, which felt different from sitting on opposite sides of a porch. He was a better companion to walk with than to sit still with. He pointed things out without lecturing, asked questions without implying he knew the answers already, and moved at a pace that matched hers without adjusting for her or ahead of her. "Tell me about Edmund Langford," he said, when they had been walking for 20 minutes and the conversation had found a comfortable rhythm. She was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to say. "He is a man who understands opportunity and nothing else," she finally said. "He saw this land as something that should have gone to a Langford man when Robert died, and he is not wrong about what the law tends to say. He is simply wrong about what's just. How long have you been running the operation alone?" 2 years. "Though I had significant involvement before Robert died, he was better with the cattle themselves. The business side was largely mine." Lyle nodded. "I've heard your name in the county. Your cattle came to market in good condition last fall, when most of the small operations were bringing in animals that had been improperly watered through the summer." She looked at him sideways. "You were checking up on me." "I was asking around about my neighbor," he said. "It's the sensible thing to do." "And what did you conclude?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you're very good at what you do," he said. "And that you do it alone in a way that most people couldn't manage." Something in her resisted being complimented. She had spent so long in a marriage where her competence was used but not acknowledged that praise felt like a trap, like something that would be taken back or used against her. "I manage," she said, and heard how flat she made it sound. He glanced at her and did not press, but he noticed. She could see that he noticed. The drought came on faster than either of them had projected. By mid-June, the creek had dropped to the point where the Langford cattle were getting insufficient water from the natural flow, and Aurelia was hauling water daily with the buckboard, and 3 large barrels she had borrowed from the grain merchant in exchange for a promise of supply credit in the fall. It was brutal work. She did it before 6 in the morning and again in the late afternoon, loading the heavy barrels with a hand pump that required constant effort, driving across rough ground, transferring water to the trough. Denny helped when she could free him from fence repair, which was constant since the dry ground was causing post-heave across her whole north line. Cal was managing the cattle nearly alone. One morning she came back from the second haul to find Lyle Irons and 2 of his men in her north pasture, stringing new fence wire on posts they had already set. They had brought their own wire and their own tools. They were a quarter through the line that needed doing. She climbed down from the buckboard and walked out to where they were working. "I didn't ask for this," she said to Lyle. He paused in his work, hammer in hand. "I know you didn't. I'm not a charity case." "I know that too," he said. "But we discussed water management and cooperation 2 weeks ago, and your north fence is 300 yards from my south fence. And when yours goes down, your cattle come onto my land, and my cattle go onto yours, and we both lose time we don't have. This is practical." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with neither aggression nor performance, simply, steadily. "When you're done," she said, "I'll feed your men dinner." "Fair exchange," he said, and turned back to the fence. She went inside and made a pot of stew from the venison she had put up and baked cornbread in the Dutch oven. And when the men came in at noon, they ate at her kitchen table with their hats off and their muddy boots left on the porch. Lyle sat across from her and ate without ceremony, and the two ranch hands, boys named Jesse and Marcus, ate with the focused appetite of young men who had been working since before light. After the hands went back out to finish the last section, Lyle stayed at the table for a second cup of coffee. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cornbread and coffee, and outside the heat pressed against the windows with August ferocity. "You're going to have to do something about the legal situation before the court date," he said. "You can't afford to go into that courtroom underprepared." She had not told him the details. He had put it together from what he knew and what he had heard, and he was telling her plainly rather than going around it. "I'm aware," she said. "Edmund Langford owes me $212 on the cattle he refused to pay for," Lyle said. "I've been in contact with 2 other ranchers he's done the same to. I think there's a pattern. A judge in a probate case might be interested in knowing about a man's business character." Aurelia set down her coffee cup. "That could matter. My lawyer has been building the character argument, but documented evidence of a pattern is different from testimony. I'll write up a formal account of the transaction and the delay and the correspondence," Lyle said. "You can give it to Crawford. So can the others. Why are you doing this?" She asked, not suspiciously exactly, but needing to understand the shape of it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands in a slow rotation that she would come to learn was his thinking gesture. "Because it's right," he said finally, "and because you're a good neighbor. And because men who use the law as a weapon against women who have done nothing except outlive their husbands make me angry." She looked at him. She was looking for the hidden motive, the secondary agenda, the thing men always wanted when they offered help. She had learned to look for it. It had served her well. She could not find it in his face. What she found instead was simple, straightforward conviction. She said, "Thank you." He nodded once and stood and went back out to check on the fence line. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after he was gone, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup, and let herself feel something she had been carefully not feeling for a long time. She felt grateful. And she felt, for the first time in 2 years, not entirely alone. The formal cooperation between them grew naturally and practically from there. They shared information about the creek, about cattle prices, about weather patterns the old ranchers in the county could read in the animals and the plants before any newspaper reported it. Lyle came on Thursdays, and she sometimes went to his place on Tuesdays to discuss water logistics. His ranch house, when she saw the inside of it, surprised her. She had expected the dwelling of a bachelor who owned 4,200 head of cattle to be either ostentatiously comfortable or indifferently bare. Instead, it was practical and quiet, with bookshelves along one wall filled with real books, not just almanacs and farm records, but history and natural philosophy, and a large table covered with maps and survey documents. He had a dog named August who followed him everywhere and regarded Aurelia with dignified interest. "You raid," she said, looking at the shelves. "When I can," he said. "Winter helps. What are you reading now?" He showed her a geological survey of the Texas watershed system, published by a professor at the Austin College. She read the introduction standing in his sitting room and felt the particular pleasure of real information, which she had missed since she stopped corresponding with her college professor cousin in Cincinnati. "Can I borrow this when you're done?" she asked. Something changed in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but a shift toward one. "You can take it now," he said. "I've read the sections I needed." She took it home and read it in 2 evenings, and brought it back with notes in the margins that she had written in pencil and apologized for. And he said, "Don't apologize," and read her notes with genuine interest. And then they talked about the creek system for an hour in a way that felt like the kind of conversation she had not had since she was a student. She caught herself smiling on the ride home and recognized it as dangerous, not because Lyle Irons was dangerous, but because she had built her entire surviving self on the architecture of not needing. Not needing was what kept her standing. The moment she needed something, needed someone, the architecture would shift, and she did not know what was underneath it. She went home and looked at Robert's grave on the hill and told herself to be careful. The court date was 7 weeks away when Edmund Langford came to her ranch himself. She was in the barn when she heard a horse come up the road, and when she came out into the late afternoon light, Edmund was dismounting at her gate with the comfortable entitlement of a man who already thought he owned the place. He was 53 years old, heavyset, with red hair going gray and the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into condescension. He had the same blue eyes as Robert but colder, with less warmth in them than a winter sky. "Aurelia," he said, as though they were acquainted enough for first names, as though he had not spent 5 years ignoring her existence. "Mr. Langford," she said. She did not move toward him. "I've come to make a practical offer," he said, "before this gets any more expensive for everyone. I'll give you $400 and 6 months to vacate. You keep your personal property, your horses, your equipment. I'll pay the back taxes on the property myself. $400 for 160 acres, a house, a barn, a herd, and 2 years of her life." She understood then that he did not simply want the land. He wanted to make her small. He wanted her to accept a settlement that proved she was exactly what he thought she was, a woman who had been playing at ownership and would eventually give it back. "No," she said. Edmund's face shifted into something less comfortable. "You're spending money you don't have on a lawyer for a case you're likely to lose. I'm offering you an exit with dignity." "What you're offering has nothing to do with dignity," she said, "and I think you know that." "Aurelia, Robert should have updated his will. I'm not saying he meant for this to happen, but the law is what it is." "The law is what people make of it," she said, "and I intend to make something different of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him recalculating, moving from a first offer to a threat. "I have resources you don't," he said. "My lawyer has handled 18 cases like this in the past 4 years. He is very good at finding documentation problems, at challenging the validity of personal claims to property when there's a competing heir." "Are you threatening me?" she asked. "I'm advising you," he said. "There's a difference." She walked to her front gate and opened it and stood beside it with her hand on the latch, which was the clearest possible indication that she was done with this conversation. Edmund looked at her. He put his hat back on. He mounted his horse. "The offer stands for 2 weeks," he said. "After that, you'll deal with Breckenridge Foster, and he is not a gentle man." He rode away. She watched him go until he was past the first bend, and then she walked to the barn and sat down on a hay bale in the deep, warm smell of horses and straw and let herself shake for a few minutes, because she was human, and because she had been afraid, though she had not showed it. She thought about $400 and 6 months to vacate. She thought about the blue curtains she had sewn for the kitchen window. She thought about the grave on the hill. She pressed her hands flat against her knees until they steadied. She did not cry. She heard a horse on the road again and thought for 1 sick second that Edmund had come back. And then she recognized the black horse, and the way the rider sat easy in the saddle and felt the tension in her chest do something complicated. Lyle was coming for the Thursday meeting. It was Thursday. She had lost track. She came out of the barn as he dismounted at the gate. He took one look at her, at whatever was showing on her face that she had not had time to hide, and his expression went still and careful. "What happened?" he said. "Edmund Langford came by," she said. "He made an offer." "I declined." Lyle walked to her and stopped at the reasonable distance he always maintained. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. She heard how automatic it sounded, how practiced. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those deep water eyes, and something in his face was very soft and very serious at the same time. "Aurelia," he said. She looked at him sharply, because he had not used her first name before. "I see you even when you hide," he said quietly. "You don't have to pretend with me." The words went straight through her like something warm and devastating at the same time. She felt her carefully constructed composure develop a crack, fine as a hairline fracture in stone, running from top to bottom. She turned away because she was not going to cry in front of Lyle Irons in her own barnyard. "He threatened me," she said, keeping her voice level through force of practice. "Politely. He said his lawyer is going to find documentation problems and challenge my claim. He offered $400 for the whole property." She heard Lyle exhale slowly behind her, then his footsteps on the dirt, and he was beside her, not touching, just standing in the space beside her like a person who was choosing to remain. "That is not going to happen," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "I know that you have a lawyer and you have documentation, and you have the testimony of 2 years of actual management of this property," he said. "And I know that I have 3 ranchers in this county who will testify in writing about Edmund Langford's business practices. I know that Breckenridge Foster has a reputation for misrepresenting evidence in probate courts that a judge in San Antonio would be interested to have brought to his attention." She turned back to look at him. "You've been doing your own research," she said. "I've been doing what needed doing," he said. There was a long silence. The evening light was coming in at an angle that made everything look warmer than it was, and the cottonwoods along the creek were moving softly in the dry summer wind. "Why?" she asked. Not for the second time, but more directly, with more of herself in the question. He looked at her for a long moment. "I think you know why," he said. She did not answer. She was not ready to answer, but she did not look away. They sat on the porch that evening and talked for 2 hours, not about cattle or water rights, but about things they had not talked about before, about where they had come from and what they had wanted and what the land meant to each of them. He told her about his father's gambling and the farm in Abilene, and the 7 years it had taken him to build the Irons Ranch from a cattle drive wage and a carefully managed loan. He talked about it with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who has processed his own history enough to speak it cleanly. She found herself talking about Robert, about the marriage that had been practical and not cruel but deeply lonely, about the feeling of being competent and invisible at the same time, of being useful and unseen. "He never asked what I thought about anything," she said. "Not because he was a bad man. He just didn't. He didn't think to. I was there and I was capable, and that was enough." "It wasn't enough," Lyle said. She looked at him. "You're saying that," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true," he said. He was not looking at her with sympathy, which would have been unbearable. He was looking at her with the steady certainty of someone stating a fact. "Being useful is not the same as being seen. You deserve to be seen." She pressed her lips together and looked at the dark line of the creek trees against the evening sky. "I'm very bad at being seen," she said. "I know," he said. There was something in it that was almost warm. "I'm still trying." She went inside before she said something she wasn't ready for. and she heard him ride away a few minutes later, and she sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time before she lit the lamp. The court date was 4 weeks away when Lyle found out that Edmund Langford had been buying up unpaid notes on small ranches through a third party, a middleman in Laredo who purchased debt from struggling creditors, and then called the notes due without warning, forcing landowners into impossible situations. He had done it to 3 operations in the county already, and the Teller farm, Martha Teller's land, was on the list. Aurelia sat with this information at her kitchen table the following Thursday, with Lyle on the other side and the evidence laid out between them in the form of documents he had obtained through the kind of patient, methodical inquiry that characterized everything he did. "He's building a land holding," she said. "He's using the probate claim on my property as the centerpiece and buying up everything around it cheap. He's positioning for the railroad." Lyle nodded. "The survey routes I've seen put the most likely path through the Dusty Creek Valley. Anyone who owns the right land when the railroad decides on its final route will make a significant profit." "How long has he been planning this?" "At least 3 years, based on the first note purchase I can document." She thought about Robert, who had died not knowing that his brother was looking at his land as a future investment. She thought about the neglect of the marriage and the loneliness she had carried alone, and she let herself feel, briefly, the enormous weight of how much she had been required to carry without knowing half of what she was carrying it against. "I want to bring all of this to Crawford," she said. "Not just the character evidence, the pattern, the railroad motive. I want the judge to see exactly what Edmund is doing." "I think that's right," Lyle said. "I can testify to the unpaid cattle debt in person. The other ranchers can provide affidavits." "The Teller farm," she said. "Martha doesn't know yet. She needs to," he said. "And the note is held by the Laredo middleman, not Edmund directly. It might be buyable before he can call it in." She looked at him. "You're talking about putting up money." He held her gaze steadily. "I can spare it. I'd frame it as a loan to Martha at whatever terms she can manage. That's between her and me. Lyle, Aurelia, I am not doing this to obligate you or her or anyone," he said. "I'm doing it because it's right and because I have the means to do something that needs doing." That's the beginning and end of it. She wanted to argue against it. Her instinct was to argue against anything that required trusting another person's stated motivations. But she had been watching Lyle Irons for nearly 2 months now, and she had not found a hidden motive, a secondary agenda, or a single instance of his stated reason for something being a cover for another reason. He was, so far as she could assess it, exactly what he appeared to be. That was the most unsettling thing about him. She went to see Martha Teller the next morning with Lyle's information and watched Martha's face go through several expressions before settling on the grim composure of a woman who was used to managing bad news. Martha was 61 and had run her farm alone since her husband Ben died 5 years ago, and she was tougher than she looked in her Sunday clothes. "That wretched man," Martha said, which was the strongest language Aurelia had heard from her in 5 years of coffee conversations. She told Martha about Lyle's offer. Martha was quiet for a long time. "He's a good man," Martha said. "I've watched him since he came to this valley. He doesn't make show of goodness the way some men do." She looked at Aurelia with sharp old eyes. "And he watches you." "He watches everybody," Aurelia said. "He watches you differently," Martha said, and went to put more coffee on. The weeks before the court date were full of preparation. Aurelia worked with Crawford in a series of letters, and one trip to San Antonio, where she spent 2 days in his office going over documents and practicing her testimony. Crawford was a compact, sharp-minded man of about 50 who had spent enough time in frontier courts to understand that the argument had to be both legal and human. The judge needed to feel the injustice, not just understand it. She came back from San Antonio tired and steadier than she had left. She had seen the shape of the argument. She could feel the logic of it holding. Lyle met her buckboard at the junction of the road when she came back, which she had not expected. He had been checking the creek marker, he said, and saw her coming. "How did it go?" he said, riding alongside her. "Crawford is good," she said. "Better than I expected. He thinks the railroad motive is the strongest element. It shows that Edmund's claim isn't about family sentiment or legal inheritance principle. It's financial calculation." "Did you sleep?" Lyle asked. She looked at him. "Not much. Eat." "Lyle, I'm asking practical questions," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost a challenge and almost tender. She looked at the road ahead. "I ate," she said. "I was too worried to sleep." "That's true. I lay in the hotel room and thought about every way it could go wrong." "And did you think about any of the ways it could go right?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said honestly. "I'm not good at that." He was quiet for a moment too, riding beside her, the horses moving at a matched pace. "I think about you going into that courtroom, and I believe you're going to win," he said. "Is that useful?" She felt something catch in her chest. "You've never been wrong about something important?" she asked. "Plenty of times," he said, "but not about people." She looked at him. He was looking at the road, but his jaw was set in that way it got when he was saying something he meant completely. "Not about you," he said. She did not say anything for a while. The road moved under the wheels and the horses walked in their companionable rhythm, and the heat of the afternoon lay golden and heavy over the dry grass. "Lyle," she said finally. "Yes." "I'm frightened," she said. She said it cleanly and flatly, without self-pity or performance. It was just the truth, finally spoken. He turned and looked at her directly, and what was in his face was not pity and not minimization. It was recognition. The look of someone who understood fear and respected her enough to simply acknowledge what she had said. "I know," he said. "And you're going to do it anyway. You've been doing that from the start." They arrived at her gate in the late afternoon and she stopped the buckboard. He reined in beside her. "Come in for coffee," she said. "I want to show you what Crawford put together." He dismounted and tied his horse at the post, and they went inside together. And for the first time, his presence in her kitchen did not feel like a calculated exchange. It felt like something else, something she was still trying to name. She laid out Crawford's draft argument on the table, and they went through it together by lamplight as the evening came on, and she found herself grateful for his mind, for the way he asked questions that sharpened her own thinking, for the way he noticed what was strong and what was still fragile in the legal structure, for the way he took her seriously as the most knowledgeable person in the room about her own situation. At some point the coffee was finished, and they were still talking, not about the legal case anymore, but about what she wanted the ranch to become. She had never talked about this out loud. She had plans, clear, detailed plans, but they had always lived only in her own head because there had been no one to think through them with. "I want to move toward breeding quality cattle rather than volume," she said. "The market for high-grade beef is growing. The trail drives are going to become less relevant as the railroad gets closer. The ranchers who survive the transition are going to be the ones who can deliver consistent quality to processors, not just numbers." Lyle was listening with his full attention, his coffee cup forgotten. "That requires capital investment up front and a longer earning horizon," he said. "Yes. It means 2 or 3 years of lower income while the breeding program develops, which is why the legal situation has to be resolved first. I can't build towards something that might be taken from me." "It won't be taken from you," he said. She met his eyes across the table. "You keep saying that," she said softly. "Because I keep meaning it," he said. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something more careful and direct at the same time. "And because I want to see you build what you're describing. I want to see this place become what you can make of it." She felt the warmth of it move through her and did not immediately look away. "Why does it matter to you what I build?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than she intended. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quietness his hands on the table were very still. "Because you matter to me," he said simply. "You have for a while now. I think you know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her chest was doing something irregular and distracting. She thought about the architecture of not needing, about the life she had built from composure and efficiency, about Robert looking through her and Edmund wanting to take from her, and the long education she had received in what men actually meant when they said things. She thought about the north fence post and the geological survey in the tin can and the way he had said, "I see you even when you hide." "I'm not easy to be with," she said carefully. "I am guarded and I'm independent, and I do not find it easy to ask for help or to believe that help is without conditions." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be easy. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are." She looked at her hands on the table. "What are you asking?" She said, "For the chance to be in your life," he said. "Honestly, without conditions. To see how it grows." He paused. "I'm not a man who moves fast, and I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I just wanted you to know where I stand." She breathed carefully. "I need to get through the court date first," she said. Not as a rejection, as a true statement of what she could manage. "Of course," he said. "After that," she said, "we can talk about this." He nodded. He stood and picked up his hat from the table. He looked at her with a warmth that was completely unguarded and that she felt against her chest like sunlight through glass. "After that," he agreed. He rode home in the dark, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time after the sound of his horse faded, watching the stars arrange themselves above the dry summer grass. She was terrified. She was, underneath the terror, something else entirely. San Antonio in August was a city being remade, brick buildings going up on streets that had been dirt a decade earlier. The railroad terminus drawing commerce from every direction. The sound of the new mixed constantly with the old. Aurelia arrived 2 days before the court date with Crawford and checked into a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Perez, who gave her a clean room with a cross on the wall and strong coffee in the mornings. She had not expected Lyle to come. He had his ranch to manage and the drought logistics to handle, and the affidavit he had written was already in Crawford's file. But on the morning of the first court session, she came down to breakfast and found him sitting in Mrs. Perez's dining room with his hat on the table and coffee in front of him, talking quietly with Crawford about the sequencing of testimony. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. His face when he saw her was something she did not know what to do with. "You came," she said. "You didn't ask me not to," he said. She sat down. Mrs. Perez brought her coffee without being asked. Crawford spread his papers across the table and they went over the final preparations. The courtroom was a high-ceilinged room in the county courthouse, with large windows that let in the brutal August light and fans that moved the hot air without cooling it. The judge was a man named Aldridge, gray-bearded and deliberate, who had the reputation of being thorough and resistant to legal theater. Edmund sat on one side with Breckenridge Foster, who was everything Edmund had promised, a sleek man in an expensive suit who looked at the room as though it was already his. He glanced at Aurelia with the particular dismissiveness of a man who had won these kinds of cases before and expected to win this one. She sat with Crawford and looked at the judge. The first day was procedural. Edmund's claim was presented. the estate documentation laid out. Foster was skilled and smooth, painting a picture of a straightforward inheritance dispute in which the law clearly favored his client. He spoke about Robert Langford's documented male line family connection, and about the absence of a will, naming Aurelia as primary beneficiary with the air of a man explaining something obvious to people who were slow to understand. Crawford's response was methodical and quiet. He laid out the documentation of Aurelia's management of the property. 2 years of records, contracts, market receipts, tax payments, all in her name. He was not theatrical. He was precise. On the second day, Aurelia testified. She sat in the witness stand and felt the entire room watching her, and said nothing internal about it. She had spent 31 years learning to manage being watched. She answered Crawford's questions clearly and directly, not performing distress, not performing toughness. Just speaking the truth about the work she had done, and the life she had built on the land. Foster's cross-examination was designed to make her seem like a woman who had been managing a deceased man's property and called it hers. He asked about decisions Robert had made, looking for examples of his authority. She answered each question with a specificity that made the next question harder. She knew the property better than any document in evidence. She knew it better than Edmund Langford, who had visited exactly once and had not walked the fence line. She answered questions about drainage patterns and grass management, and heard health and market timing with the confidence of a woman who had lived all of it. And she watched Foster's smooth assurance develop small cracks as he failed to find a foothold. On the third day, Crawford presented the railroad motive evidence. He presented it carefully, drawing on Lyle's testimony about the unpaid cattle debt, on the documented pattern of note purchases through the Lairdo middleman, on the county survey data that placed the most probable railroad route through the land Edmund was accumulating. He presented it not as accusation but as context, as the explanation for why a man who had never shown interest in a rural property was suddenly aggressively pursuing it. Edmund's expression during this section was something Aurelia watched from across the room. It moved from condescension to calculation, to something harder and colder when he realized the evidence was stronger than he had expected. Foster objected to the railroad evidence twice, and was overruled both times by Judge Aldridge, who was apparently interested in context. Lyle testified in person. He sat in the witness stand with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to perform anything, and he described the unpaid cattle transaction, and the pattern of delay and the character of his dealings with Edmund in plain, direct language that the judge wrote notes on. He was not a man who was easily discredited. He did not embellish and he did not hedge. He simply told the truth. When he stepped down from the stand, he passed Aurelia's table and his eyes met hers for one brief moment. She felt the steadiness in it move through her. Judge Aldridge took 2 days to deliberate. Aurelia waited. She walked along the San Antonio River in the mornings and ate Mrs. Perez's cooking and sat with Crawford in the evenings going over contingencies. Lyle stayed, which she had not expected and which she tried not to read into too deeply, while knowing that she was absolutely reading into it. They walked along the river together on the second evening. The city was cooling slightly as the sun went down, and the sound of the river and the evening birds and the distant noise of the town made a texture around them that was strangely peaceful. "Whatever the ruling is," she said, "I want you to know that this would not have been possible without what you did." "The case would have been strong with or without me," he said. "The case might have been strong," she said, "but I would have gone into that courtroom alone, and that matters." He looked at her sideways. The evening light was warm on his face. You're the kind of person who would rather say it doesn't matter, he said. Yes, she said. Old habit. How's the habit holding up lately, he asked. She considered. Somewhat less well than it used to, she admitted. He smiled then, and it was the first real full smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face into something that made it difficult to look away from. Good, he said. They stood at the river railing for a while in the comfortable quiet that had become their particular kind of togetherness, and she felt the nearness of him without the pressure of it, and something in her chest that had been compressed for years began, slowly and carefully, to expand. Lyle, she said. Yes. I have been alone for a long time, she said. Not just since Robert died. For most of my life, in the particular way that means no one really seeing you. I have built myself around that. I'm not sure all of it will come apart cleanly. I'm not asking for it to come apart, he said. I'm asking to be part of what you build with what you have. She was quiet for a moment. That is a very thoughtful way to put it, she said. I've had time to think about what to say, he said. And there was a self-awareness in it that made her feel something warm and specific move through her. She turned to look at him directly. He turned to look at her. The distance between them was the same reasonable distance he always maintained. She closed half of it. He closed the other half. The first time he kissed her was gently, briefly, with his hands not reaching for her at all, just his face coming to hers, and then a pause and the question in his eyes and her answer, which was to lean into it rather than away. It was nothing like the efficient, practical exchanges of a marriage that had been more partnership than love. It was careful and warm and full of the particular sweetness of something that had been built slowly and honestly over weeks. When they stepped apart, the river was still moving and the city was still making its evening sounds and the stars were coming out above the Texas sky. After the ruling, she said softly. I know, he said, equally soft. She slept that night for the first time in 2 weeks. Judge Aldridge issued his ruling the following morning. He found for Aurelia Langford. He found that her 2 years of active management of the property, combined with the documented pattern of Edmund Langford's acquisitive behavior and the demonstrable financial motive behind the probate challenge, placed the claim in bad faith. He found that Texas community property doctrine, interpreted with the full context of the evidence presented, supported the widow's claim to the marital property in the absence of a will that explicitly designated otherwise. He noted, pointedly, that the court did not look favorably on the use of inheritance law as an instrument of financial speculation. Edmund Langford was ordered to pay court costs. Breckenridge Foster was notably quiet. Aurelia sat at the plaintiff's table and heard the words and felt them move through her like water through dry ground. Crawford shook her hand. He was smiling. She turned in her seat and found Lyle 3 rows back, and his expression was the quiet, steady thing that she had come to understand, meant everything he couldn't easily say. She went to San Antonio to save her land, and she was coming home with it, and with something else besides. The ride back to Dusty Creek was 3 days, which they mostly traveled in the same direction, Lyle having come by horse and Aurelia by stage. They shared meals at 2 stations along the way and talked with a new ease, a new permission to be direct with each other about things that had previously only been implied. He told her about the loneliness of the Irons Ranch in winter, which surprised her. He had built such a sufficient-looking life that she had not considered the inside of it closely enough. The work fills the days, he said, but the evenings are a long time. She understood that completely. I read a lot, she said. I know, he said. I noticed the books at your place. You have good taste. You inspected my bookshelves, she said. You inspected mine, he pointed out. She laughed. which she did not do often enough and which felt different than it used to, less controlled. He looked at her when she laughed in a way that was entirely transparent about how he felt. She did not look away from it this time. They were back in Dusty Creek by Friday, and by Saturday, she had gone through the house and opened all the windows and cleaned everything and checked on her cattle and walked the fence line and stood in the south pasture, where the Irons cattle had wandered in June, and thought about everything that had changed since that morning. On Sunday, she visited Robert's grave. She stood there for a long time. She was not angry at Robert. She had moved past the useful stage of that. She was grateful for what had been good and sad for what had been absent and clear-eyed about the difference. She had been given the land, and the land had been worth fighting for, and the fight had changed her. She was not the woman she had been when she came to that grave a year ago, 2 years ago. She was something more complete. She said what she had to say to Robert Langford, which was private and true, and she walked back down the hill feeling lighter. Lyle came on Thursday, and they sat on the porch in the evening, and she told him she wanted to move forward with what they had been circling. "I am not going to stop being independent," she said. "I want you to understand that. It's one of the things I admire most about you," he said. "I am going to be difficult sometimes," she said. "I will go quiet when I should talk, and I will try to hide things when I should show them." "I know," he said, "and I'm going to see through it every time." She felt the warmth of that move through her. "Yes," she said, "you do that." They sat in the cooling evening, and the first real breath of autumn was in the air, and the cottonwoods by the creek were beginning to go gold. "The breeding program," she said. "I've been thinking about the capital requirements. If we coordinated, shared resources in a formal arrangement. Are you proposing a business partnership?" he said, and something in his voice was warm and a little amused. "I'm proposing to think out loud," she said, "about what a future might look like if it was built together instead of separately." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the cottonwoods. "I've been thinking about the same thing," he said. He turned to look at her. "Aurelia, I would like to ask you to marry me. Not because of the practical advantages and not because of the ranch, though those things would be good together too. Because I want to spend my time with you. Because you are the best person I have encountered in a long time, and I want to know you for the rest of my life." She looked at him. She breathed carefully. "Ask me properly," she said softly. He stood from the porch chair and turned to face her, and he was entirely serious and entirely sincere. "Will you marry me?" She looked at his face, the steady deep water eyes and the strong jaw and the warmth in him that he didn't show to most people but had shown to her from almost the beginning. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the space between them and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything for a while. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and somewhere down the road a bird was calling in the early dark. They were married in Dusty Creek in October, on a day that turned out clear and blue after 3 days of rain. Martha Teller cried. Denny and Cal stood in the church in their best clothes, looking as though they had been recently starched. August the dog waited outside and somehow got into the reception anyway. Crawford came from San Antonio and shook Lyle's hand and told Aurelia she was one of the best clients he had ever had, by which he meant one of the most prepared and one of the most quietly courageous. They held the reception at the Langford place, which was now the Irons place too, though they kept the Langford name on the property because it was hers, and it would remain hers, and Lyle had been adamant about this in a way that had made her throat tight with something she was still learning to simply feel instead of manage. Edmund Langford sent no acknowledgement. The railroad survey came through the following spring, and the route passed 2 miles north of the Dusty Creek Valley, missing Edmund's accumulated holdings almost entirely. Aurelia heard about this from Crawford and felt something clarify inside her that had been waiting to clarify for a long time. The hidden motive had never been as clever as Edmund thought, and the trap he had built for her had closed around nothing but air. The first winter was the best winter she had known in years. They combined the operations in the way she had outlined, the breeding program on her land, using the iron's capital investment to select quality bulls and to grade up the herd over several years. Lyle ran the volume business and the market relationships. She ran the breeding program and the finances for both. It was a partnership in the most complete sense, and they disagreed about things regularly and argued about specific choices, and then resolved it by listening to each other with the genuine attention that each had learned, separately, to find rare. At night the house was warm and the lamp burned on the bookshelves, and they read sometimes in companionable silence and sometimes talked until they had no more words, and the long evenings that had been a problem were a problem no longer. She stopped hiding. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. He saw through it when she tried, gently and with that particular humor that she had come to love, and she found that being seen was not the collapse of architecture she had feared. It was the ground under the architecture becoming more solid. In the spring of 1883, she told him she was expecting. He was at the fence line when she came to find him. She had been thinking about how to say it for 3 days. She walked up to where he was working and waited until he turned. She told him. He stood very still for one moment. Then he came to her and held her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then pulled her against him and stood there in the field with the spring grass bright around them. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm terrified and completely happy," she said. "Both of those things at the same time." He laughed softly. He held her. "That seems right," he said. Their son was born in November of 1883. They named him Robert Daniel Irons, and Aurelia stood by the choice of Robert because it was right to remember what had been and what had been good in it. And Lyle did not question it, which was one of the things she loved about him. Robert Daniel was a loud, healthy, red-faced baby who had his mother's eyes and his father's lungs, and he announced his arrival in a way that left no one in the house unaware of it. August the dog inspected him with great dignity, and then appointed himself the child's guardian, which was a role he took seriously until the end of his life. Martha Teller came to see the baby and held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many grandchildren, and she looked at Aurelia across the top of the baby's head with her sharp old eyes and said, "You look different than you used to." "Different how?" Aurelia said. "Like yourself," Martha said. "Like you finally let yourself be yourself." Aurelia thought about this. She thought about the woman who had stood in Callaway's general store, reading a letter that threatened everything, pressing her face into stillness while the world fell. And she thought about what it had taken to find the crack in that composure, and then to find that what was underneath it was not as fragile as she had feared. "I had help," she said. Martha made a small sound that was entirely knowing and went back to looking at the baby. Lyle found her on the porch after Martha went home, nursing the baby in the last light of the afternoon. He sat down beside her without speaking, and August arranged himself at their feet with a contented sigh that expressed the household feeling better than words could. She looked at her son's dark, lashed eyes, which were closed in the profound unconsciousness of the very recently fed. She looked at the land that was hers, that was theirs, that the creek crossed in its seasonal rhythm, and the cattle moved across in their quiet herds. She looked at the grave on the hill, which she would visit on Sunday as she always did. She looked at Lyle. He was watching her with that expression that she had once found unsettling, and now found to be the most familiar and welcome sight in her life. The expression that said he was paying attention, that he was here fully, without the need for her to perform or hide or compress herself into a manageable shape. She had spent most of her life invisible to the people around her. She had learned to navigate by hiding, to protect herself by making herself small and composed and useful and unremarkable. She had been good at it. She had survived by it. And then a man with a stone wall reputation and deep water eyes had looked at her in a general store in Dusty Creek, Texas, and seen something she had not shown. She had spent months trying to hide it, out of habit, out of fear, out of the deep training of a life that had taught her that being seen was dangerous. And every time he had seen through it. Not aggressively, not as a power, simply as a fact. I see you even when you hide. She reached out and took his hand, which was warm and large and work-calloused and familiar, and he closed his fingers around hers without looking down or making anything of it. Just held on. The baby made a small sound of absolute contentment. She had feared the future for so long. The fear had served its purpose, and she was ready to put it down. She sat on her porch in the November light with her husband's hand in hers, and her son asleep against her and her land breathing quietly all around her, and she did not hide anything at all. In 1884, the second year of the breeding program, the Irons operation brought the best graded cattle to the county market, and the price difference more than covered the investment of the previous 2 seasons. The approach she had outlined in Lyle's kitchen, which had been at that point theoretical and contingent on survival, was proving out in real numbers. She sat with the accounts in the evenings while Robert Daniel, now walking with the emphatic and often destructive determination of a 1-year-old, made his way around the sitting room touching everything at arm's reach. August followed him at a patient distance, occasionally positioning himself as a barrier between the child and the more fragile items. "He's going to pull those books off the shelf," Lyle said from across the room. "Let him," Aurelia said. "He can learn to put them back." Lyle raised an eyebrow at this but did not argue, and indeed did not need to, because Robert Daniel reached for a book at the bottom of the shelf and pulled it with great satisfaction, and then sat down on the floor next to it and regarded it seriously, apparently prepared to study. Aurelia looked back at her accounts and smiled to herself. They expanded the ranch house the following year, adding 2 rooms to the east side, 1 more bedroom for the children they hoped for, and 1 proper study for Aurelia, which had her bookshelves and her desk and her account records and her notes on the breeding program, and which was hers in the particular way that a room you have wanted for yourself and never had is yours when it finally arrives. Lyle had suggested it, had measured and planned and done a significant portion of the carpentry himself with the help of a builder from town. And on the day it was finished, he had taken her hand and walked her into it, and she had stood in the doorway of the sun-lit room and felt something so complete, an unguarded move through her that she had turned and pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, which was the closest she came to crying. He put his arms around her and held on. "There she is," he said quietly. "Just that." She laughed against his shoulder, which became something that was halfway between laughing and crying but was entirely all right because she was with him. The second pregnancy was in the spring of 1885. This time she was less afraid and more simply impatient, and she told him before she had decided how to say it, coming in from the barn one afternoon and finding him at the kitchen table with the accounts. "Another one," she said. He looked up. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "Due in the fall." He was on his feet in the time it takes to understand good news, and he crossed the kitchen and kissed her properly, with both hands and complete attention, and said against her hair, "Robert's going to need to learn to share." Their daughter was born in September of 1885, small and dark-haired and fierce from the first moment, which none of them would ever find surprising. They named her Clara June Irons, and she had her mother's composure and her father's deep water eyes, and a voice that she used without hesitation, which everyone agreed was perhaps the most important thing. Robert Daniel, who was almost 2, regarded his sister with the careful suspicion of a person whose territory has been altered, and then settled into a proprietary fondness that would characterize their relationship for decades. Martha Teller came to see Clara and held her with great authority and said, "She looks like she knows exactly what she wants." "She's 2 days old," Lyle said. "Some people come in knowing," Martha said. Aurelia, recovering in bed, watched her daughter in Martha's arms and thought about knowing. About the things you know from the beginning that you spend your life finding your way back to. About herself at 20, at 25, knowing what she was and knowing what she needed, and the years of misdirection and quiet erasure that had covered it over, and the slow, careful process of uncovering. About a fence that came down in the rain. About a letter that fell from her fingers. About a man who stood in a general store and saw something she had not shown. She thought about the word hidden, about all the years she had spent making herself small to survive, and about the fact that the part of her that had survived was now here in this house, in this room, in this life, and was neither small nor hidden but simply herself, which had turned out to be enough. Which had turned out to be, for the first time, genuinely enough. Lyle sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder and watched the light change in the study across the hall where her shelves stood full, and her desk held the accounts of a successful year, and the notes toward a life that was being built forward in time, day by day, season by season, with the patience and attention of people who understood what they had. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first time you said you could see me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I wanted to disappear," she said. "Right then. I wanted to take it back, whatever you'd seen." "I know," he said. "I'm glad I couldn't," she said. His arm was around her, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the particular quality of his attention that had never changed since the morning he looked at her across a general store and knew something was wrong. "So am I," he said. Outside, the September evening was settling over the dusty creek valley. The cattle were in the south pasture, and the creek was at a good level, recovering from the summer's drawdown. The cottonwoods were beginning to turn. Down the road, Martha Teller's lamp was coming on in her window, and her farm was secure and hers. The note long paid and the threat of Edmund Langford's ambition dispersed into the indifferent history of men who had wanted things that did not belong to them and found them beyond their reach. The land was whole. The family was whole. The long loneliness was over, not with a dramatic end but with a gradual filling, like the creek coming back after the drought, inch by inch, until one day you went to check the marker and the water was where it ought to be. She did not hide anything that evening. She sat in the warmth of the house she had saved, and the life she had built and the love she had been terrified to need, and she let all of it simply be there, visible and true, in the gentle light.